Hey everyone, welcome back to the garage. Today we are starting out with doing a fuel rail rebuild. We'll be putting SR20 injectors into a KA fuel rail. We've seen fuel rail rebuilds and injector changing done before on the channel, so I'm going to kind of speed up through this. But one thing I did notice in that we kind of covered this with the SR car is that these fuel rails seem to have a tendency to get bent and out of angle. So I went ahead and checked the one I was using. Sure enough, it too was bent and had like a curve through the middle, so the middle two injectors were not quite sitting down far enough. I happen to have, as of the current count, 7 KA dual red cam fuel rails. So I went through and chose between them all and found the flattest of them and decided to use that one. As always, some of these machine screws that are Phillips head and don't have a hex on them were nice and stuck, and as always, a good pair of vice grips is the way to go there. Just clamp down into the soft metal and give it just a little bit of a turn, and then it goes nice and easy. I'm sure a good penetrating oil would have been great for this, but I don't like to use penetrating oil around injectors. The set of injectors in this fuel rail are just regular KA ones, but they're good injectors, so I didn't want to ruin them. Just a little WD-40 to help break the rubber seals loose. The PB blaster and stuff like that is the stuff I tend to stay away from. I had a whole set of injectors go bad shortly after using PB blaster to help loosen them, so that's enough proof for me not to use it. Then I use just a little bit of carb cleaner to clean out the fuel rail of any debris and gunk that has gotten into it and has been sitting for some time, so who knows what was in there. Next, we're going to go about rebuilding these SR injectors. This is a set from Brent's car, so they're 370cc SR20 injectors. You can tell by the purple top. These are just stock OEM units with what look like probably original gaskets and everything on them. So I bought kits that come with the top, the bottom. It comes with the grommets that go on the intake. These are pretty much temporary injectors. I don't intend to stick with these for very long, so not too terribly much effort going into it. The biggest thing for me was making sure they are sealed. I have had so many issues with these side feed injectors leaking that I do not want to have that issue again here. So I'm taking a lot of extra time and caution with putting the O-rings on and installing the injectors into the fuel rail. Next up, we will go about changing out the fuel pressure regulator from the factory unit to this adapter, which basically just makes the end of the fuel rail into another like bib, so you can hook up a fuel line to it. Because we are using an external fuel pressure regulator now, we no longer need that assembly like lobbed onto the end of the fuel rail. Now for the really fun part, installing the fuel rail onto the car. Gotta clean out the holes on the intake real well with an old sock, because that's how I roll. And then install the new rubber grommets. These rubber grommets are really, really important for especially regular KAs. I know I've said this before, but these are like the #1 thing. If you have a stock KA, you should replace these because they go bad, and then it creates an air gap around the injector, which not only lets air in, if you have a boosted car, it lets air out. So yeah, really important to replace these. As with all of the seals and grommets and everything to do with this fuel system, a little bit of oil on all of these helps it all go together much easier and keeps you from splitting those O-rings or cracking the grommets or things like that. You want everything to slide together. It may be that if you do that, for the first, couple minutes or so of running, that you have a little bit of a leak as the gas kind of washes away the oil, but trust me, that's a lot better than splitting one of those O-rings. And then putting this fuel rail onto the car, we're going to be real careful with it and not force anything, because when you force this fuel rail on, that is how they get bent. So you got to just line up the injectors perfectly. It's really tempting to just get the two bolts lined up right and just torque it down and push it down into the fuel rail or push it down into the intake. Not the way to go. You gotta be easy with it. It's real soft metal. It's almost like brass-like. It's a very strange metal, but it is quite pliable. And there we have it. One set of SR injectors installed, hopefully leak-free. The next thing that we will need to figure out is the fuel lines and hook up this fuel pressure regulator. The first step of that is installing a new fuel filter. The most common upgrade of a fuel filter for these cars is to go with a 300ZX twin turbo fuel filter. It is much larger, as you can see, and just flows a little bit more fuel, holds a little bit more fuel in it too, which is nice. You know, you have a little bit of a fuel reserve there for your pressure. For all of this, we are using fuel injection fuel line, which is something that I did not know existed for a very long time of working on cars. I had always just been going down to the parts store and saying, hey, give me some 3-gauge fuel line. Turns out fuel injection line is indeed much better. You'll notice if you just use regular fuel line on a car like this, it eventually balloons out. And if you see it ballooning out, it's actually ballooning in too, so it restricts the inside of the fuel line. So, important lesson learned there. This case, I'm using all fuel injection line, and hopefully it stands up quite nicely, as well as some new clamps on all of the ends of these lines. Doing a little bit of playing around here, trying to figure out the best way to run the lines. The most important thing is making sure that the line isn't chafing on anything. We don't want a ruptured fuel line, obviously, and we don't want it to be restricting flow by kinking anywhere. You'll notice on the factory setups, they use more hardline. They'll only run the rubber fuel lines for a few inches at a time, and I do believe that is for that reason. They don't want it to chafe on anything or get kinked anywhere. So in this case, we're having to use quite a bit of rubber line. So I think it's really important to make sure nothing is necessarily rubbing right against anything sharp or just going to over time rub through anything. There is also quite a game of Tetris going on over here. There's so much more going on this side of the engine than there previously was, and that was already quite a bit. The intake assembly of a KA is quite a thing, so there's already a lot going on. Here I'm reviewing how the fuel pressure regulator is run. It is backwards from what I initially thought, so the bib going out from the side that you see should be going down. It should be going to the tank, and then the bib that is pointing up is the one that should be pointing towards the fuel rail. So basically the fuel comes in, goes through the filter, goes up into the fuel rail, runs through the fuel rail, runs through and past all of the injectors, and then goes out where we put that fuel pressure regulator adapter. Then it goes into the fuel pressure regulator. The fuel pressure regulator clamps down, to give it pressure, or releases to relieve pressure, and that relieved pressure, I don't know if that was the right term, but that fuel then goes down into the line that goes back to the tank. Add those backwards, so I've got to rotate this fuel pressure regulator 90 degrees to have those hoses facing in the right direction to solve one of the problems I was talking about earlier. I was getting into the situation where the hoses wanted to kink because they were having to make turns. The easiest solution to that was just turn the regulator, have all the lines pointing in the right direction. Now we are hooking up vacuum to the fuel pressure regulator, and when the engine is idling, the throttle plate is closed, but the pistons are still moving up and down. When the pistons move down, it's creating space, it's drawing in air and pushing it out the exhaust. But because the throttle plate is closed, the only thing it can do is cause negative pressure in the intake manifold. Therefore, you have vacuum. That vacuum opens up the fuel pressure regulator, which lets the fuel kind of just keep scooting right by it. Lowers the fuel pressure, because we don't need fuel pressure at idle. But then when you hit the gas, that negative pressure goes away because you opened up the dam that lets the air rush in. There will now be positive pressure because of the supercharger, which causes the fuel pressure regulator spring to clamp down, which increases the amount of fuel pressure you have so you can make the power. Also, that little line we just fed through the firewall is for a boost gauge so we can monitor the boost and the vacuum. Now to start tackling some of the other intake accessories like the idler control valve, the intake, the actual throttle positioning of the intake and stuff like that. I do suppose that now that we're this far along, it's time to bite the bullet and accept that we have mounted this intake and it's not going to come back off. So we're going to tighten down the intake. The thing I want to take note of when we're doing that is the distance between the bottom of the supercharger and the oil filter. I'm still using the regular oil filter. I have a new one, but I want to make sure that there's enough space even between this one. So we'll see. when it comes to actually tightening down one of these manifolds, the absolute best thing in the world is an extension with a tapered connector on it. Now that we've got it snug down, taking a look at the oil filter, it seems like we're in pretty good shape. There's still a little bit to go, but now to try and remove this oil filter that I just placed back on there to make sure no contaminants got into the engine. However, because I just placed it on there, I did not oil the O-ring for the oil filter, which means it is now stuck. I am recording this voiceover the next day, and my arms are extremely sore from trying to remove it. But eventually I remembered that the best way to do that is to take a long flat blade screwdriver and a hammer, and right next to where the oil filter meets the oil filter adapter, just hammer away at it, little chips, and you see it starts to rotate. The best way to do it, the oil filter is strong enough right there, there's a bead of metal right there that I can take it, and it's the only way to fly. Now for the new oil filter, it is a Motorcraft unit. Motorcraft has found its way into many parts on this car, and they do actually make pretty good stuff from what I've read. But mostly I got this one because it had the smallest diameter of any oil filter that fit this motor. It's very, very minor. It's maybe like 1/10 of an inch smaller, but in this case we can use all we can get. You can see here it's pretty close. And I haven't even finished tightening the manifold yet. Again, using my 1/4 inch ratchet because I think the 1/4 inch keeps you from over tightening these, and that is a big problem with the aluminum manifold onto aluminum heads. You don't want to over tighten. It's pretty good. There's definitely a little bit more room than there was with the Bosch filter that was on there. I actually took a piece of paper to slide between them just to make sure it wasn't like an optical illusion that there was space between the two. I am still a little worried that there might be contact as the engine torques over. Now granted, the supercharger and the oil filter are mounted to the engine, but I think the whole intake manifold may get pressed down a little bit as the tension of the belts and everything pull on that supercharger. We'll have to see. I guess I'll just keep an eye on it and make sure there's no marks on the oil filter. But as you see, we've started now fishing the wiring harness through everywhere, looking for the best ways to mount it. Didn't really do a whole lot of video on this because it's super tedious just searching for the right place for it to go. Alright, so I haven't done a whole lot of on-camera talking this time because a lot of the stuff I've been doing is just so long and drawn out that it's hard to make cohesive video of. So here's just a little bit of a update as to where I am. We did the fuel rail and then the fuel lines and such. And now we have moved on to wiring after a short interlude of fixing the oil filter situation that ended up not being a situation at all. So now I am diving into laying out where the wiring harness is, and once again it was hard to keep video going of that because it's just a constant put it here, no I don't like that spot, let's put it over here, let's run it through this instead. Trying to keep things easy to get to if something goes wrong, and B, somewhat organized and not ugly. So here is where we are. So we started here fuel side after getting it through the firewall, so the connectors down there and the other hookups, a lot of that stuff is stuff I'll need help with the guy who put this together. And then from here it splits off into, this is for throttle body, this is for idle air control valve. These guys might be the ones to cause me some problems because I really want to put the idle air over here. That might not happen. We'll see. Decided I needed to figure out where this stuff would go first and worry about that later. Okay, so under here is the harness for the injectors, and then coolant temperature sender for the computer and coolant temp for the gauge. Up here we still need to run, there is an extra fuel, a coolant temperature sender that I need to put into there. So then, let's see, from here we go ignition side. Now I have heard from a friend of ours, Caswell, who does a lot of automotive stuff like this and knows a little bit about Megasquirt, that separating the ignition from the fuel is really important with this version of Megasquirt. So in the future, if we start seeing some weird stuff with injector firing, we may look into separating this further. But this may be good enough because the coil stuff is way over there. Over here, had a heck of a time running these wires, and still got some adjusting to do. I'll put them under this, the brake booster line. That'll be easy. I ended up flipping the coil upside down, or probably right side down. Sure, we'll go with that verbiage. So that the connector wouldn't interfere with the hood. Got the little, I think this is like a, some kind of impedance thing. It's like a big resistor. And then this, I assume, will be O2 hookup. This will be for this guy. And holy crap, Ford, your connectors are bizarre. Like, the retention on these things is crazy. That one too. But this will just need to be mounted somewhere. And that is pretty much it for the side. Oh, there's also a ground wire I need to hook up. It goes right to the factory ground spot. Alrighty, well this turned into quite the day. It is now about 12:30. Started working on it at around 7:30. Just kind of was in one of the moods today that felt like doing a lot of the tedious work that needed to be done. And I did. Got a lot of stuff done that's been begging to be done, but just wasn't very interesting to show for video. So let's take a little tour of what it looks like right now. Alright, so it is up in the air at the moment. I got the front up because I needed to do some stuff underneath. I buttoned up the chassis harness, which is here and is now secured up there. And then, let's see, nothing else really right there, but you can see that the intake is on, and it is somewhat bolted in. I need to scrape this gasket here and get a new gasket on there. I didn't have that today. And I need to buy a new one of these because this is the one off of Brent's car that had a hole in it. So definitely need to get one of those. I decided to put the idle air control valve here, and what you can see here is inlet, and then it goes through here, and this is opening or closing. Just basically decides how much air gets through, and then this goes beyond the throttle body and lets air in to let it idle. Over here things get a little bit messy, but kind of, it's just kind of how it is. It's with this over here now and the intake over here now. This side of the engine bay, very busy, very cramped. It's all fitting. There was a lot of fiddling around getting things to fit. I do think I will run this differently the next time I install the intake here. The fuel lines are all run. The boost signal line is run. The harness is all run through. Everything is fitting fine. The only thing left over here is to get a vacuum line that will go from this down through and into the hole here that will run down to the ECU, because that is where the map sensor is located. On this side, nothing much changed. We have this wire that I think I was looking for earlier. A nice little chassis, basically mount here to keep that wire from getting into the header or anything like that. And it goes down to the crank angle sensor, which hopefully you can see. Got the igniter, I believe. Igniter? I think so. It's light. Mounted up over here. Alright, up underneath the car, you see there is our new O2 sensor. The factory one way up there on the header will no longer be used. This, still on the header, but it's down in the collector, is where on an S14 the secondary O2 is. And with a wideband sensor like this, apparently you get a cleaner signal further down, and we're getting the signal of all 4 cylinders, not just one. So that's a good thing. And I tied that up into here, just to keep the wire out. And I have no idea if you can see this, but there is the basically the brain box of the wideband, and then those wires go up into the car through the same hole that the harness goes through. Alright, well that will probably be a wrap for this time. I think we made a lot of good progress. I really am running out of things to do, which is a good thing, because that means that we're getting pretty close to you know, what everybody's waiting for, the first startup. I am talking to the owner of the original build here. He had this supercharger and computer setup running on another car. So I'm going to get him over to help me finish up some of the interior wiring, which is basically how the computer and the O2 sensor and all that stuff gets its power, that gets a little weird because it's not just connectors that are like, okay, this connector goes to this. It's just like bare blade connectors that need to be hooked up right, and I'd rather have his guidance in that stuff. I'll try to get it on video, but we'll see. Off camera, I'm going to continue to do a little bit of the nitpicky stuff. I want to do ground and stuff like that for the battery. I'm going to clean up some of the connectors on the battery. I think I already mentioned that at some point. New blades for those, or not blades, but just new connectors that are soldered in instead of crimp fit. You know, really, there's not too much left, is there? I don't know. We're getting pretty close. Hope you guys are excited. Thank you all for your support. Thanks to everybody on Patreon for helping me get this build going. And I'll see you next time. Also, look out for Cone's Garage Super Project. Yep.